Most prisons announce themselves. They have walls you can touch, bars you can see, and doors that tell you exactly where your freedom ends. But there is another kind of prison that almost no one notices until an entire lifetime has passed. It follows you into every room you enter. It speaks every word before you do. It decides which opportunities feel impossible, which dreams feel unrealistic, which fears deserve your obedience. The cruelest part is that it never introduces itself as a prison. It introduces itself as you. Every time you hear the thought, "This is just who I am," another brick is quietly laid. By the time you are old enough to question it, the walls have become so familiar that you mistake them for your home. Imagine that tomorrow morning every person you've ever known suddenly forgets who you are. Your name means nothing to them. Your reputation disappears. Every compliment you've received, every insult you've believed, every label you've carried simply vanishes. No one remembers whether you were confident or shy, successful or unsuccessful, intelligent or average. For a brief moment, every identity you have spent years protecting is gone. Now, ask yourself something that is far more uncomfortable than it first appears. Who would you be if there were no one left to remind you who you have always been? Most people think freedom would begin there. Philosophy suggests something far more disturbing. The prison would still exist because the person who remembers your identity most vividly is you. More than 2,000 years ago, Socrates walked through Athens asking questions that seemed almost absurd. He questioned politicians, poets, craftsmen, and scholars, not because he enjoyed proving people wrong, but because he had discovered a pattern. Human beings rarely suffer because they know too little. They suffer because they become certain too soon. They cling to ideas they have never examined, then spend the rest of their lives defending them. The greatest of those ideas is the one each of us carries silently, the story of who we believe ourselves to be. The moment a story stops being questioned, it stops being a guide and starts becoming a prison. Think about a child learning to walk. When the child falls, no one says, "Perhaps walking just isn't who you are." Failure is expected because growth demands it. Yet, somewhere along the journey into adulthood, something changes. One rejection becomes, "I'm not lovable." One public embarrassment becomes, "I'm just not confident." One betrayal becomes, "I can never trust anyone again." A temporary experience quietly transforms into a permanent identity. The event lasts a moment. The conclusion lasts decades. Without realizing it, we stop learning from life and start becoming loyal to the stories life once forced us to create. Here's the first truth that almost no one wants to hear. Your personality may not be revealing who you are. It may only be revealing what you once needed to survive. And if that is true, then the person you've spent years protecting may never have been you at all. Every prison has an architect, not someone standing outside with chains in their hands, but someone quietly laying one brick at a time until a wall begins to appear. The architect of your prison was never a single person. It was every experience that taught you what was safe. Parents' criticism that made silence feel wiser than honesty. Classroom full of laughter that convinced you never to risk looking foolish again. A relationship that ended so painfully you decided love itself was dangerous. None of these moments were meant to define your life. They were simply moments. But the human mind has never been satisfied with moments. It demands meaning. It searches for patterns. It asks, "What does this say about me?" And in its desperation for certainty, it often arrives at the wrong answer. The mind is a remarkable storyteller. It can take a single chapter and convince you it is the entire book. Fail often enough and it stops saying, "You failed." Instead, it whispers, "You are a failure." Be ignored enough times and it no longer says, "They didn't notice you." It quietly concludes, "You are invisible." Notice what has happened. Reality has disappeared. In its place stands an identity. That identity begins making decisions long before your conscious mind has a chance to intervene. You stop applying for opportunities because people like you never succeed. You remain silent because you've always been quiet. You tolerate disrespect because you're not the type to confront people. The prison no longer needs walls. Your beliefs now perform the same function. Modern psychology calls this confirmation bias. Once you accept an identity, your mind becomes its most loyal lawyer. It gathers evidence that supports the story while quietly dismissing everything that contradicts it. Imagine carrying a notebook for your entire life. Every time your identity is confirmed, you write it down in bold ink. Every time reality proves the opposite, you tear out the page before anyone can read it. Years later, you open the notebook and confidently say, "This is who I am." But it was never an honest record. It was edited evidence. The verdict had been decided long before the trial began. Plato understood this long before psychology gave it a name. In his allegory of the cave, prisoners spend their entire lives watching shadows move across a wall. Having never seen the sun, they believe the shadows are reality itself. Now imagine those shadows are not cast by a fire, but by your own memories. Every label you've accepted, every fear you've rehearsed, every sentence that begins with, "I've always been," becomes another shadow on the wall. Eventually, you stop looking beyond them. You stop asking whether they are true because they have been with you for so long. Familiarity disguises itself as truth. But here is the detail most people miss about Plato's story. The prisoners were not physically incapable of leaving. They were psychologically incapable of imagining a world beyond the cave. And that raises a dangerous possibility. Perhaps the reason you feel trapped today is not because your prison has stronger walls than everyone else's. Perhaps it is because you have lived inside it for so long that you can no longer imagine yourself without it. That is the moment when the prison becomes almost impossible to escape. Because the walls are no longer around you. They have become the shape of your own mind. If the story ended here, then escaping would be simple. You could blame your childhood, your parents, your teachers, or every painful experience that shaped you. You could point to the people who placed the first bricks around you and convince yourself that they are the reason you remain trapped. But every prison reaches a moment when the builders disappear. Your parents are no longer standing beside you. Your childhood classroom no longer exists. The people who judged you have moved on with their lives, and many of them probably do not even remember what they once said. Yet, the prison remains exactly where it was. That is because there comes a point when the prison no longer needs architects. It only needs a guard. The frightening truth is that the guard now wears your face. This was the realization that fascinated Friedrich Nietzsche more than almost any other. He believed that human beings spend most of their lives trying to preserve themselves when life is actually asking them to overcome themselves. Every day you wake up and continue a performance that began years ago. You react in familiar ways. You think familiar thoughts. You tell yourself familiar stories until they no longer feel like stories at all. They feel like facts. The ego loves this because it values certainty above freedom. It would rather suffer inside a familiar prison than risk becoming someone it cannot immediately recognize. That is why real change feels so uncomfortable. It is not because you are becoming the wrong person. It is because the old person is slowly losing control. Imagine an actor who has worn the same mask every day for 30 years. At first, he knows it is only a costume. Then the years pass and the audience applauds the performance. Eventually, even the actor forgets there is a face beneath the mask. One day, someone reaches forward and tries to remove it. Instead of feeling relieved, he feels terrified because without the mask, he no longer knows who he is. Most people spend their lives exactly like that. They defend the mask because they have mistaken it for their identity. They are not afraid of change. They are afraid of meeting the person who exists underneath everything they have been pretending to be. That is why the ego fights so hard whenever you begin to grow. The first time you speak with confidence after years of silence, it whispers that you are pretending. The first time you refuse to tolerate disrespect, it tells you that you have become selfish. The first time you choose discipline instead of comfort, it insists that this is not your real personality. Listen carefully to that voice because it reveals something extraordinary. It never asks whether your new actions are wiser. It only asks whether they are familiar. The ego mistakes repetition for identity and habit for truth. It does not protect who you are. It protects who you have been. This is where Marcus Aurelius offers one of the most practical lessons in all of philosophy. He rarely asked himself what kind of man he was. Instead, he asked what the present moment required of him. There is a profound difference between those two questions. One keeps your attention trapped inside yourself, while the other turns your attention toward reality. A person who constantly asks, "Who am I?" becomes obsessed with protecting an image. A person who asks what is the right thing to do now quietly begins building character. One worships personality, the other practices virtue. And perhaps that is why the prison survives for so long. It convinces you that freedom is found by discovering yourself, when in reality, freedom begins the moment you stop defending yourself. The walls do not collapse because you find a better identity. They collapse because you finally realize you never needed one. The moment that truth becomes clear, the prison begins to lose its power. Because a prison cannot hold someone who has stopped believing its walls are real. There is an old saying that every cage leaves its door open long before the bird realizes it can fly. Human beings are not so different. We spend years searching for the key to our freedom while carrying it with us every single day. The key has never been hidden in another book, another philosophy, or another person. It has always existed in a single decision. The decision to stop believing every thought that introduces itself as your identity. That sounds simple until you try it. The next time your mind says, "I'm just not confident enough," don't argue with it and don't accept it. Simply ask, "Who taught me that?" You may discover that the voice speaking inside your head has not belonged to you for a very long time. It belongs to an embarrassed child, a frightened teenager, or a wounded version of yourself that has been trying to protect you for years. Respect that version of yourself, because it kept you alive when you needed protection. But do not allow it to decide the rest of your life. This is the difference between memory and wisdom. Memory repeats the past while wisdom learns from it. Memory says, "This happened before, so it will happen again." Wisdom asks, "Is that actually true, or have I simply never questioned it?" That single question has the power to interrupt years of unconscious living. It creates a space between the story and the storyteller. Within that space, something remarkable happens. You realize that you can observe your thoughts without becoming them. You can experience fear without obeying it. You can remember your past without living inside it. The moment you discover that separation, your personality stops being your prison and becomes nothing more than one chapter in a much larger story. Most people never reach this point because they spend their entire lives trying to improve the prison instead of leaving it. They decorate the walls with better habits, more achievements, and greater success, yet they never question the walls themselves. They become more productive versions of the same frightened identity. They become wealthier prisoners, more respected prisoners, more disciplined prisoners. Yet a prison covered in gold is still a prison. Philosophy has never promised a more comfortable cage. It has always pointed toward the courage to walk beyond it, and that is where the final realization begins. Not with a new identity, but with the end of the old one. Perhaps this is why the greatest philosophers never tried to tell people who they were. They never handed out identities. They asked questions. They created doubt. They shattered certainty because they understood that certainty is where growth quietly dies. Socrates never claimed to possess all the answers. Nietzsche never asked you to become someone else. Marcus Aurelius never promised a life without hardship. What united them was a single belief that echoes across centuries. A human being is not meant to preserve the self. A human being is meant to examine it. The moment you stop examining yourself, you begin repeating yourself, and repetition has a strange way of disguising itself as destiny. Think back to the image we began with, a prison without walls. At first it seemed impossible because every prison needs stone iron and locked doors. Now you can see why this one is different. The walls were built from conclusions you stopped questioning. The bars were forged from habits you kept repeating. The guard was the voice that insisted nothing could ever change. And the lock was never made of steel. It was made of certainty. The certainty that this is simply who you are. Remove that certainty and something extraordinary happens. The entire structure begins to fall apart because it was never standing on truth. It was standing on belief. Imagine meeting yourself 20 years from now. Not the version with more money, more success, or more recognition. Imagine meeting the version of you that finally stopped carrying yesterday's identity into today's life. What would be different about that person? Perhaps they would still feel fear, but they would no longer obey it. They would still remember painful experiences, but they would no longer build a home inside them. They would still have strengths and weaknesses, but neither would become a definition of who they are. They would understand that personality is a tool, not a prison. A mask that can be worn when useful and removed when it is no longer needed. That is what freedom has always meant. Not the freedom to become whoever you want whenever you want, but the freedom to respond to life without asking permission from an identity that was created years ago. Every moment becomes a quiet choice. You can repeat the person you were yesterday, or you can meet this moment as if it deserves a new response. That choice is available every morning, and it asks nothing from you except awareness. No one else can make it for you, and no one else can take it away. So the next time your mind whispers, "This is just who I am," pause for a moment before you believe it. That sentence has closed more doors than failure ever could. Replace it with a different question. Is this who I am, or is this simply the oldest story I have never stopped telling? You may not discover the answer immediately. In fact, you probably won't. But the question itself changes something. The walls begin to crack. Light enters places that have remained dark for years. The prison that once felt permanent suddenly looks fragile. And then one day you will look back and realize something almost impossible to believe. The prison was never holding you. You were holding the prison. And the moment you finally let go, there is nothing left to escape. The ancient Greeks carved a simple inscription above the temple of Apollo at Delphi. Know thyself. For centuries, people have interpreted those words as an invitation to discover their identity. But perhaps there is another way to understand them. Perhaps knowing yourself does not mean collecting more labels. It means having the courage to question every label you have ever accepted. It means looking at your fears without calling them your nature. Looking at your habits without calling them your destiny. Looking at your past without allowing it to write your future. Because the moment you stop confusing who you are with who you had to become, life changes. Not all at once, not with some dramatic revelation, but quietly, one decision at a time, one thought at a time, one moment of awareness at a time. And somewhere along that path you may notice something strange. You no longer wake up asking, "Who am I?" Instead, you wake up asking, "What is the right thing to do today?" That is the moment personality loses its power, because character has taken its place, and character is never trapped by yesterday. It is built by what you choose now. So perhaps the greatest act of freedom is not escaping the prison. It is realizing you were never meant to live inside it in the first place. Thank you for watching.